The article begins by explaining the disaster that occurred. The disaster being a collision of flight KLM 747 and Pan Am 747, resulting in the loss of 583 lives. Next, the article goes into the environment at Tenerife, including the demands and other issues that could have assisted in the crash, such as pressure, individualism, lack of communication, and complexity. The author also gives research leads to be pursued for each issue. The author discusses the 6 misunderstandings that led to the tragedy in Tenerife, including the request of 2 clearances, the controller using the words "after takeoff" heard as permission to leave, confusion when the flight crew said "we are now taking off." There was also a squeal in the microphone that could have led the crew to believe the message was not for them. The controller didn't wait to receive acknowledgement after ordering them to stand by for takeoff, and the controller was calling one of the planes different names. The author addresses the question of how the small errors led to the loss of 583 lives. The logic of the article is to analyze all of the errors that occurred leading up to the crash, as well as how understanding those errors apply to other disasters. If the reasoning in the article is used in other areas, it will be easier to solve small errors as they arise. Several main points to be made from the article. The flight crew of the KLM flight was under immense pressure before the disaster occurred. The pressure they were facing included long work hours that could lead to fines or imprisonment, difficult maneuver of the plane, and the weather. Each of the different areas of pressure created stress that the crew would have not otherwise experienced. The stress that the crew was experiencing produced regression to their first learned responses. This is something that is uncontrollable when in a situation that requires quick action. KLM also had interruptions, such as a diversion of the flight and a cloud moving closer. This took the attention away from radio transmissions. There was also negative synergy as the first officer would not voice his opinion. Communication is key during times like these, and everyone should be on the same page in stressful environments. The conclusion of the article includes several suggestions for future research. It is important to have a clear understanding of stress. This can be done by researching how to refine and make the concept more precise. Stress results in ambiguity because of the blending of emotion, anxiety, strain, pressure, and arousal. Having a clear understanding of these areas can help to mitigate stress. Pluralistic ignorance should be restudied to see how it contributes to the early stages of a crisis. Pluralistic ignorance occurs when I am confused about a situation, but I assume that I am the only one confused. There could be a correlation between group interactions and task complexity. Research should be conducted to see if, as group interaction improves, task complexity decreases, and will therefore decrease stress. Conducting further research and becoming knowledgeable on these topics should prevent disasters similar to Tenerife from occurring. Some implications for practice are to establish communication, and if things do not make sense, then speak up. Develop interpersonal skills by selecting the right people for the job on the basis of their skills. If interpersonal skills are not present, conduct training to ensure the right people have the right skill set. Stress from personal lives and stress from work can accumulate, but people who are under stress should share with those dependent on them what they may be going through, and that their performance may not be up to standard. Lastly, remind people to be mindful and think about tempting situations so they do not act in mindless fashion.
Now we'll go into the organizational lessons that can be learned from the Tenerife disaster. In this section, I'll be talking about the ways interruptions, stress, and mental regression contributed to the disaster and how detrimental they can be in disorganizing a situation and increasing volatility. Of course, it goes without saying how this volatility can result in huge disasters, but these examples can also be useful in other scenarios. Stress is explained by Weick as the discrepancy between demands and ability. Although it might be assumed that the larger the discrepancy between demands and ability, the higher the chance of low probability, highly destructive outcomes. the data shows that this isn't true. These destructive outcomes seem to occur when ability is close to meeting demands. At this ratio, the individuals involved typically are under the impression that they can make it work and overcome the obstacle. Many times this just adds fuel to the momentum of the disaster and further complicates it. Stress is something that affected all of the individuals who contributed to the disaster. In one form or another, these individuals had attempted to deal with their stressors and in the process had clouded their normal problem solving and mental capabilities. If each of these individual situations had occurred independent of one another, they most likely would have been able to manage each of these situations. But in a complicated system, these failures, which are small, they compound on each other and form more instability. And in this case, that instability allowed the crashing of 2 commercial airplanes. So, to state the lesson on stress plainly, in a system that is reliant on many different decisions and actions, each decision and action must be first evaluated in respect to the other decisions and actions. A contributing factor to the stress itself, and mentioned numerous times in the TNRIF article, was interruption. The flight crew had a limited amount of time to get to their destination due to laws regarding crew flight time. So that initial stressor was worsened when that flight was diverted, which added an extra delay. The initial interruption started a domino effect of clouded mental decision making and worsening stress. This example provides a lesson that basically mirrors what we learned about with stress. It is a small inconvenience that only adds energy to an already unstable situation or a situation that's becoming unstable. The last thing I'll talk about in this section is how stress and interruption, which contributes to more stress, can affect the decision making of individuals. When faced with an unforeseen event, most people revert back to familiarity. What they learned first, what they do most often, what is ingrained just from repetition. In the case of TNRIF, a good example of this mental regression is the pilot's decision to give himself clearance for takeoff. There was a language barrier between the pilot and the air traffic controller, and instead of getting a third party to confirm what the air traffic controller had told the pilot reverted back to what he does most often, which was give himself clearance for takeoff. That mistake was not necessarily the critical mistake that caused the disaster. It was only the last mistake made. The disaster itself was the result of a string of mistakes that each contributed to instability.
The circumstance that forms the setting of this article is the disaster that took place in Tenerife. The purpose of the article is to explain what happened that day, including the events leading up to the collision. The conversation revolves around this tragedy and allows the author to analyze the event as a whole. However, something had to cause the crash to occur, and that is where the additional information comes in. The location of the disaster is also important. Tenerife is a small island off the coast of Spain. The island is 2,073 feet above sea level, so clouds float into the airport. The flight crew was under a Dutch law that puts limits on flight and duty time. If not followed, fines or imprisonment could result. Therefore, the crew was on a time limit to make it to Amsterdam legally. Although the circumstance was not an ideal one, it gives researchers an opportunity to study the errors that caused this disaster. Having a better understanding of pressure, stress, and complexity can help people to manage them more efficiently.
The lessons of this study can be applied to other areas that rely on a complex system of independent decisions and actions. First, we'll go into stress and the management of stress. In reality, stress is something that everyone experiences and at some level is just a natural part of life. The key to managing stress is in identifying the stress and evaluating it outside of the narrow space that it exists. Questions can be asked in regards to the stress, such as, is the stress going to impact decision making? Will that clouded decision making affect other unrelated areas? And if that is the case, is there a potential for multiple failures to compound on one another? With respect to the Tenerife disaster, if someone had been asking these questions, the commercial flight company may have realized that pressuring the flight crew into meeting unrealistic deadlines could impede on the flight crew's ability to efficiently make decisions. And if faced with further dilemmas, that flight crew may not have the ability to properly manage them. And since we're talking about a commercial flight carrying passengers, it would seem that a decision to make time to organize another crew that's not close to exceeding their legal flight time would be the most reasonable. This line of thinking can be applied to a huge number of other fields and situations with the same result. A more well-rounded understanding of how the system works and a new ability to make efficient decisions. In addition to stress, the concept of communication can have a wide application. Lack of communication between either individuals or groups most generally results in fractured, less efficient problem solving. The idea here is that the more brains that are involved in a decision, the higher the chances of a unique and well thought out decision. The more individual experiences, personality types, interests, specific knowledge, the higher the chances of a successful decision. With Tenerife, the pilot made no effort to consult with his colleagues on how to deal with the language barrier. In fact, after some extra research, I found that his co-pilot actually urged him to wait and get confirmation of what message the air traffic controller was trying to convey. The pilot, having many more years at the helm of a commercial plane, discounted the relatively new co-pilot's comments and continued acting on his decision. Like I mentioned before, the co-pilot was new and had recently been through training on the proper runway etiquette. The pilot, on the other hand, was a veteran who most likely hadn't had the same training or that training had occurred far in the past. If the pilot had the capacity to communicate and consider what the co-pilot had said, the outcome may have been different and the disaster may have been avoided. Finally, we'll look at the concept of interconnectedness and how it can apply to other organizations. Although the many pieces of an organization or event seem to act independently from one another, there is the potential for overlooked forces that exist in connecting them. The unearthing of these forces requires the shift from observing data and numbers to observing patterns and pattern shifts. For example, in Tenerife, the air traffic controller existed as a force that connected the KLM and Pan Am pilots' actions. If not for the misunderstandings, the results of the two pilots' actions would have relatively not affected each other. In summary, all of these applied lessons have one thing in common: the requirement of deeper, less structured observations and evaluations.